The body was on the ground before the sun reached the middle of the sky. There were no witnesses. There was no law. There was no word yet for what had just happened, because it had never happened before. Cain looked at his hands. Then he looked up, and the sky gave him nothing back. No thunder, no fire, no voice. Only the sound of wind moving through the grain he had planted, the same grain God had refused. In the distance, the altar his brother had built was still warm. The smoke from Abel's offering had long since dissolved into the afternoon air, but Cain could still smell it. Or perhaps that was only memory. Perhaps those two things had already become the same. He did not run. There was nowhere to run that was not still the earth. And the earth, as he was about to learn, had already taken note of what had happened here. The ground beneath his sandals was the same ground he had broken every morning for years, the same ground that had given back to him reluctantly everything he had coaxed from it. It knew his weight. It had received his sweat. And now it had received something else. He stood very still in the middle of all that stillness. This is not a story about a murder. Murders in the long record of human history are not rare enough to carry the weight this one carries. This is a story about what grows in a man's chest when he believes deeply, quietly, and with complete sincerity that he has been treated unjustly by God. It is a story about the distance between offering something and surrendering something, and it is a story about a door that remained open far longer than the man standing outside it was willing to believe. To understand what happened in that field, you have to go back further than the crime. You have to go back to the very beginning of these two lives, to the names their mother gave them, to the landscape they inherited, to the slow accumulation of days that produced, without any single dramatic moment, the conditions for what happened when the fire moved toward one altar and not the other. You have to go back to the names. When Eve held her firstborn son, the first child born to any human woman in all of human history, she said something that the text of Genesis preserves with care. "I have acquired a man with the help of the Lord." The Hebrew verb she used from the root kana means to acquire, to obtain, to possess, to gain. She named him accordingly Cain. It is a name that carries weight from the moment it is spoken, a name that says, this one was gotten, this one was earned, this one represents something won, something secured. In the ancient world, the firstborn son was not simply the eldest child. He was the living guarantee of the family's continuity. He was the one who would carry the name forward, who would inherit the double portion, who would speak for his father when his father could no longer speak for himself. The firstborn son was the primary investment, the most important relationship, the center of gravity around which the family's future organized itself. Cain arrived into the world with all of that expectation already wrapped around him like a garment he had not chosen and could not remove. And the text gives us no indication that he resented it, at least not at first. He appears, in everything the narrative records about him, to have accepted the weight without complaint. He worked, he produced, he built. He was in every visible sense exactly what a firstborn son was supposed to be. The second son arrived differently. Eve named him Hevel. In every English translation of the Hebrew scriptures, that name becomes Abel. But the Hebrew it comes from is important. Hevel is not simply a proper name with no other meaning. It is the ordinary Hebrew word for breath, for vapor, for the kind of wisp of moisture that appears in cold air and is gone before you can track where it went. It is the word used by the teacher in Ecclesiastes, written centuries later, to describe the fundamental quality of everything human beings spend their lives pursuing. Hevel hevelum, he writes, breath of breaths, vapor of vapors, everything is hevel. Two brothers, one named like something gained, one named like something that cannot be held. They grew up together east of Eden. This geography matters. The text of Genesis establishes that after the expulsion, Adam and Eve were placed east of the garden, outside it, on the far side of the cherubim and the flaming sword, in a landscape that was no longer curated and provided, but was wild and resistant and required labor to produce anything at all. God said to Adam, before they left, "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat your food." This was the world Cain and Abel were born into. Not the garden, the country outside the garden, the difficult country where the earth did not simply offer itself, but had to be persuaded, where every harvest was an argument won against resistant soil, where the seasons could not be fully trusted, and the rains could not be commanded, and a man who planted in spring was placing a bet whose outcome he would not know until autumn. Cain became a farmer in that country. He worked the ground, the same ground the curse had landed on, the ground that was not supposed to yield easily. He chose the hardest relationship with the most resistant element of the landscape, and he committed to it. He planted, he returned, he waited, he harvested, and then he planted again. This is not the life of a passive man. Farming in the ancient Near East, with no metal tools and no irrigation systems and no crop science and no insurance against failure, was an act of sustained will against an environment that did not particularly want you to succeed. Cain succeeded. The text records no failed harvests, no catastrophic losses. He brought an offering, which means the harvest had produced something worth bringing. Abel's choice was different. He kept sheep. The shepherd's existence in the ancient world was one of movement, following the animals where the grass was, reading the land for water, making camp in different places across the seasons. It required a different kind of attention than farming, not the attention of forcing something to yield, but the attention of understanding what was already there and moving with it rather than against it. Abel learned in the company of sheep a patience that his brother's vocation did not teach, the patience of arrival rather than conquest. Three things appear in the text before the altar scene, before the fire, before the rejection, before Cain's face fell, that the careful reader notices before any of the characters do. They are not labeled as warning signs. The text does not flag them, but they are there, visible to anyone who slows down enough to look. The first is the word that describes Cain's offering. When the text records what Cain brought, it says simply, "some of the fruits of the soil." In Hebrew, the word for some here, min, is a perfectly ordinary preposition that means from or of. But its ordinariness is the thing worth noticing. There is no quality marker. There is no indication of firstness or choiceness or the best of what the harvest produced. Cain brought some of what the soil had given him. The text records this without judgment, but the contrast with Abel's offering makes the difference audible. When the text describes Abel's offering, the specificity changes completely. Abel brought fat portions from the firstborn of his flock. Firstborn, that word in Hebrew, bekor, carries enormous weight. In the world of Genesis, the firstborn of anything is consecrated, honored, set apart. The firstborn son inherits double. The firstborn animal belongs in a particular way to the Lord. Abel did not bring a middle-aged sheep with adequate fat content. He brought the firstborn, the first and the best, along with the choicest portions. This was an offering that cost something. The firstborn of a flock is the animal you would have kept for breeding, the animal who represents the flock's future productivity. Abel gave away his flock's best future claim. The second thing the reader notices is the sequence. Cain offered first. As the elder son, as the one whose name meant acquired and gained, Cain moved first toward God. There is no indication that either brother received a divine command to bring an offering on this particular day. Both of them came to this moment on their own, both moved by whatever it is in human beings that reaches toward the source of things. Cain arrived first at the altar with some of his harvest, and the text records it, and then records what Abel brought, and then records what happened when the fire moved. The third thing the reader notices is in what is not described between the brothers. There is no conversation recorded between them on the way to the altar. No shared discussion about what to bring, no agreement about the form their worship would take, no moment of communion between two men approaching the same God with their respective labors. They arrived at the same place and stood implicitly apart. Two men who had grown up in the same household, who shared the same parents and the same landscape and the same cursed ground, arriving at God separately. The distance between them is not yet hostility. It is not yet dangerous, but it is there, in the space the text does not fill. Touch before any judgment falls on Cain, before the fire moves and the face falls, and the voice of God asks the first of its two devastating questions, it is necessary to sit with what Cain was. He was the first. In a world with no models, no older brothers who had figured this out ahead of him, no examples of what faithfulness looked like in practice, Cain was the prototype of human sons who try. He watched his father work ground that fought back and decided that this was what men did. He did not wait to be told. He did not look for an easier way. He planted things and came back to them and waited for them to become what he needed them to become. There is a faithfulness in that pattern. It is not the right kind of faithfulness, as the fire will reveal, but it is not pretended faithfulness. Cain believed in his labor. He committed to his land. He showed up. He was also the first person in recorded human history to bring an offering to God. This is worth sitting with for longer than the story usually allows. There was no temple to go to. There was no priest to make the offering on his behalf. There was no Levitical law specifying which category of produce was acceptable and under what conditions. There was no book of instructions, no scroll of regulations, no precedent. Whatever moved Cain toward an altar in the first place, whatever arose in him that said, something is owed here, something should be given back, came from somewhere inside him with no external prompting the text records. That instinct was not wrong. The instinct to worship, to offer, to bring something from the labor of your hands to the one who made the hands. That instinct is not a mistake. What was underneath the instinct is what the fire will expose. There must have been mornings before any of this When Cain walked the boundary of his fields in the early light and felt something that had not yet curdled into what it would become. The fields were his, in the sense that any piece of the cursed earth can belong to the person willing to labor over it long enough. He knew where the soil was deep and where it went thin. He knew which rows caught the first light and which ones needed to wait for the sun to angle around the ridge. He had learned this ground the way you learn a language, slowly, through mistakes, through seasons that taught him what seasons teach. And there were mornings when the light came across the grain in a particular way, and the whole field seemed briefly to be something given rather than taken, and something in his chest moved toward it. That movement was what brought him to the altar. It was real. It was the beginning of something that could have been faith. Abel, in those same mornings, moved through a landscape shaped by the animals he cared for. The sheep grazed where they grazed, and Abel went with them, not directing so much as accompanying. He had learned to read the land through their movements, to understand water sources by where they gathered before he could see the stream. His knowledge was of a different kind than Cain's, not the knowledge of forcing, but the knowledge of following. And somewhere in the long hours of that following, something in Abel had settled into a posture that, when it came time to stand at the altar, looked different from the outside and was different from the inside. The writer of Hebrews, looking back across the full distance of centuries, crystallized the difference in a single phrase. By faith, Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. The Greek word is pistis, trust, settled, active confidence in something unseen, not intellectual agreement with a proposition, but the orientation of an entire person toward a reality they cannot hold in their hands. By pistis, Abel offered. The sacrifice was the visible expression of something happening at a deeper level, a surrender that had already occurred before the animal was brought to the altar. Cain's offering was also real. The labor behind it was real. The intention to worship, whatever form that intention took in Cain, was real. But underneath the offering was something that would only become visible when the fire moved, a transaction, a careful, sincere, completely unexamined expectation that visible faithfulness would produce visible return, that God, having received, would give back in kind, that the altar was an exchange point rather than a place of surrender. This is the wound that everything else in the story grows from. And it is not a wound that belongs to a different species of person than the one reading this. The offering as transaction, the worship that keeps an internal ledger, the faithfulness that waits for its receipt, is one of the oldest and most persistent distortions of genuine devotion. It feels like faith from the inside. It performs all the visible behaviors of faith. It stands at the same altar and brings what the harvest produced and expects the fire to come. And when the fire goes elsewhere, it is genuinely shocked. Because from inside the transaction, there was nothing obviously wrong. Cain was the elder son. He had worked the hardest of the ground. He had produced something to bring. He had arrived first. He had done the visible things in the right order. And somewhere underneath all of that, he carried the quiet, unexamined certainty that God kept accounts the way human beings keep accounts, that labor plus offering should equal acceptance, that the math should work out. Abel had not done the math. That was the difference. Could the fire move toward Abel's offering? What exactly this looked like, the text of Genesis does not say. Whether smoke rose in a particular direction, whether something descended, Whether the sign was visible or felt or known in some other way entirely, the text is silent on the mechanism. What is not silent is the outcome. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. Both brothers knew the rejection was not a private disappointment communicated in secret to Cain alone. It was an event that happened between them in the open, with both of them present to witness what the fire chose. And Cain's face fell. Via panav. His face fell. The Hebrew is a physical description of something that happens in the body before the mind has entirely processed it. The moment when a man who has been holding himself in a particular shape simply stops holding. Something dropped in Cain's expression in that moment that would not, in any meaningful sense, fully rise again. Then God spoke. And what God said in this moment, before any punishment, before any accusation, before any confrontation with what had happened at the altar, is one of the most under-examined passages in the entire book of Genesis. Why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? Read that again. God came to Cain in his anger, in the moment of his deepest humiliation, while his face was still fallen, while the altar smoke was still in the air, and God asked him a question. Not a rhetorical question designed to begin an accusation, a genuine question, an invitation. Why are you angry? The question was an opening into honest examination. It was room for Cain to say, because I worked hard and it was not enough. Because I feel overlooked and I do not understand why. Because I brought what I had and it was refused, and I do not know what the difference was between my offering and his. Because I am humiliated. Because I am confused. Because something I believed about how this works has been contradicted, and I do not know what to do with the contradiction. Any honest answer to that question would have been the beginning of something, the beginning of understanding what the offering had been missing, the beginning of the kind of self-examination that leads not to shame, but to transformation. God was not asking the question of a prosecutor preparing an indictment. God was asking the question of someone who genuinely wanted Cain to follow it to its honest end. And then, before Cain could respond, or in the silence where a response should have been, God said something that every subsequent reading of this story should slow down at. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? The door was still open. The rejection of the offering was not the rejection of Cain. God was standing in front of Cain at the lowest moment of Cain's life and telling him directly, this is not finished. The path to correction was being handed to him while his face was still fallen, while the smoke from his brother's altar was still visible, while the humiliation was fresh and the anger was burning. Not after he had recovered, not after he had demonstrated sufficient contrition. Right now, in the anger, in the fallen face, in the exact middle of what felt like the worst possible moment, the way forward was being shown. Then God said the harder thing, the warning, but if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. The Hebrew word rovetz, crouching, is not a mild word. In other places in the Hebrew scriptures where this word appears, it is used to describe an animal in the predatory posture, pressed flat against the ground, still patient, already oriented toward its target, waiting for the moment when the target's attention shifts. God was not telling Cain to be careful about abstract moral failure. God was describing a specific, positioned, patient predator that was already at the door. It desires to have you, God said, but you must rule over it. This sentence contains, in compressed form, the entire moral architecture of the moment. The desire of the sin for Cain is real. It is not hypothetical, not merely possible. It is already crouching, already desiring, and the mastery Cain must exercise over it is also real, possible, required, and entirely in Cain's hands. God did not say, "I will hold it back for you." God did not say, "I will remove the temptation." God named the predator, identified its posture, confirmed its desire, and placed the response fully in Cain's authority. This is the most precise and complete warning in the earliest chapters of Genesis. God named the problem. God showed Cain the way through. God described what was waiting if Cain did not take the way through. And then God stopped speaking, and the next decision was Cain's. Cain said nothing the text records. There is no response. The conversation ends, and the next verse tells us that Cain spoke to Abel. Some ancient manuscripts preserve a fragment that appears to have been lost from the Hebrew text. In those manuscripts, Cain said to Abel, "Let us go out to the field," as though it was an ordinary suggestion, as though the field was simply where they were going, the way brothers sometimes go places together without particular ceremony or explanation. Abel went with him, because in the ordinary life of two brothers who had grown up together in the same household, walking with Cain toward the fields was not an unusual invitation. It required no caution, no hesitation, no reading of subtext. Abel went because the invitation was familiar. The most devastating word in the entire sequence is that word, familiar. What made the murder possible, in the end, was not violence or rage breaking through some surface that should have held. It was trust. Abel went to the field because going to the field with his brother was the kind of thing he had done before. The text of Genesis moves through the act itself with an economy that is its own kind of violence. Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. 9 words in most English translations, fewer in Hebrew. No description of the method, no description of Abel's response or expression or last words, no dramatization, just the bare fact, recorded in the same plain voice the text of Genesis uses for everything from the creation of the world to the naming of cities. 1 sentence. And then the world was different in a way it would never stop being different. What happened in that field was not the result of a moment's passion. The anger had been building since the altar. The warning had been heard and not acted on. The door had been shown and not walked through. The predator that God named had found the open moment, the moment between the warning and the choice, the moment when Cain's attention had been entirely consumed by the figure of his brother walking beside him into the field. And it had sprung. What Cain killed that day was not only a man. The rabbinical tradition of interpretation, responding to that unusual plural form of the Hebrew word for blood, demeh, your brother's bloods, drew from it a teaching that the Talmud records and that has shaped Jewish ethical thought ever since. Whoever destroys a single life, it is as though they have destroyed an entire world. Because from any single human life, an entire world of descendants might have come. Abel had no descendants. He had no children, no grandchildren, no line that continued after him. He was, when Cain finished, an ending that was entirely ending, a life that closed without sequel. The field was the same field it had always been. The grain moved in the same wind, and Cain stood in the middle of it all, in the middle of what he had done, in a world that had permanently changed and showed no visible sign of having done so. God came. Of course God came. God had come before the murder with a question and a warning. God came after it with another question. Where is your brother Abel? Cain said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? The phrase has become, across millennia of usage, so familiar that its audacity has been almost completely worn away. We say it now as a way of describing a question about the scope of individual responsibility toward others. But in its original context, in the mouth of the first man who ever killed another man, standing in the field where it happened, the phrase is something else entirely. It is a deflection wrapped in the shape of a philosophical question. It is the voice of a man who knows exactly where his brother is and is asking a question that sounds like genuine inquiry in order to avoid having to answer one. It is also, and this should not be overlooked, an inversion of everything God had said to Cain before the murder. God had told Cain that mastery over sin was possible, that Cain must rule over the predator at his door. And now Cain was standing in the aftermath of not ruling over it, and his first response was a question that contained within it a claim of ignorance. I do not know, as though he had not been in the field, as though his hands were not the hands. God did not argue the point. God did not present evidence. God did not begin a formal proceeding. What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. The word for blood is in the plural, deme, bloods. The blood of Abel and all the people who would have been born from Abel. The entire uncreated world of Abel's descendants crying from the ground together, the ground that had received them, the same ground Cain had broken every morning for years, the ground that had been his livelihood and his identity, and his argument with the curse had become the record of what he had done. The curse that follows is specific. The ground, which already resisted human labor, would now resist Cain's labor completely. It would no longer yield its strength to him. He had given it something it had not asked for, and now it would give him nothing back. Every handful of soil that had represented his relationship with the land, every harvest he had produced through the sustained effort of years, would now be withheld. The thing he had built his life around was taken from him by the same ground he had taken so much from. And then the second part, he would be a wanderer on the earth. The Hebrew word nad means to wander, to move without settling, to be restless and unsettled. And then the geography. He would eventually go to a place called Nod, which comes from the same root. The land of wandering. God was not simply describing a punishment. He was describing a man who would become, in his wandering, the definition of the place he wandered to. For Cain's response is the passage in this story that most readers move past too quickly, because it contains the only moment in the entire account where something other than anger or evasion comes through Cain's words. My punishment is more than I can bear. Gadol avoni minso. The Hebrew carries an ambiguity that is not accidental, or if it is accidental, it is the kind of accident that contains more truth than a deliberate choice might have. The word avoni means both my punishment and my sin. The verb can mean both to bear and to be forgiven. The sentence is simultaneously, my punishment is greater than I can carry, and my sin is too great to be forgiven. Both readings are active at once. Cain may not have known which one he was saying. He may have been saying both. He said he would be hidden from God's face. He said anyone who found him would kill him. He was afraid. After everything, after the anger at the altar, after the deflection in the field, after the first evasion in human history, he was afraid. He had done the worst thing, and now he was frightened of having the worst thing done to him in return. This is not redemption, but it is human. It is recognizable. The man standing in the consequence of having ignored every warning is now afraid of consequences. Something in him has cracked open just far enough to feel what he had refused to feel before. And then God did the thing that has troubled careful readers of this text across centuries of engagement with it. God put a mark on Cain. The text is explicit about what the mark was for. If anyone kills Cain, God said, he will suffer vengeance 7 times over. The mark was placed on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. Whatever the mark was, and 2 millennia of scholarship and tradition have produced more proposals than consensus, its function was protection. God was marking a murderer in order to ensure his safety. The man whose hands had done the first killing was being shielded by God from being killed. There is no clean way to receive this detail. It does not fit neatly into any framework that treats God's justice as simply proportional. It is not the ending a reader who loved Abel would write. It is not the ending a reader focused on moral order would design. It is the ending the text records, and the text records it without explanation, without apology, without apparent concern for the discomfort it produces in the person reading it. The mark of Cain, in popular imagination across centuries, became a symbol of permanent condemnation, a sign of divine rejection, a mark of shame and exclusion. This is the opposite of what the text says. The mark was not condemnation. The mark was shelter. God gave Cain something to protect him, and Cain left. He went east. He settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. In the geography of Genesis, east is the direction of exile, the direction of increasing distance from what had been. East of Eden was where his parents had gone. East of that was where he was going now. He became a man walking in the direction of his punishment, carrying the mark that kept him alive into a land whose name was the sentence he was living. The man sentenced to wander stopped wandering. This is the detail that resists easy interpretation. Cain, who had been told he would be a restless wanderer on the earth, who had been exiled from everything his labor had built, who carried the curse of a ground that would no longer yield to him. Cain settled. He chose a place. He laid foundations. He built walls. He named what he built after his son Enoch, and in the naming of it, he did what human beings do when they are trying to make something permanent. He attached the future to the present through the continuity of a name, a city in the land of wandering, built by the hands that the ground had cursed, from stones pulled from the same resistant earth that would no longer give Cain its strength. This is not a triumphant act. It is not presented as one. The text records it in the same flat voice it uses for everything. One more fact in the long list of facts that constitute the aftermath of that day in the field. But it is not nothing. There is something, not a virtue exactly, not a moral quality, but something in the choice to build when you have been sentenced to wander, in the choice to name something after a child rather than after a crime, in the choice to lay a foundation in a land that has no foundations in its name. Cain was exhausted, marked, cursed, exiled, afraid, and he built something anyway. Not because the building of it changed what he had done, not because it repaired anything that needed repairing, but because the alternative, to lie down in the land of wandering and simply wait for the wandering to end, was the one thing he apparently could not make himself choose. Weeks later, the walls of Enoch were higher. Months after that, children were born into the city, children who had their father's face and did not yet know what that face had seen, what those hands had done, what the mark meant that their father carried. They were born into a life that had no right to exist and grew up in it as though it were ordinary, because to them it was. They knew no other Nod. They knew no other city. They knew only that their father had built something and named it for them, and that the walls were solid, and the days continued. The descendants of Cain are listed in Genesis 4, with the same economy the text uses for genealogies throughout the first 5 books: names, relationships, occupations, the passing of time. And embedded in that list are details that, if you move past them too quickly, you miss entirely. One of Cain's descendants, Jabal, became the ancestor of those who raise livestock and live in tents. The craft of shepherding, Abel's craft, the work that produced the offering God accepted, the way of life that seems in the narrative to be associated with the right orientation toward God, continued through Cain's line. The thing Cain had destroyed was carried forward by Cain's own children. They raised the animals their father's brother had tended. They learned the patience of following rather than forcing. They kept the practice alive that had begun with the man who lay in the field. Another descendant, Tubal-Cain, forged tools of bronze and iron. He became the ancestor of metalworkers, the craftsman who would eventually produce the instruments of agriculture, of construction, of the slow material accumulation of civilization. The hands that descended from Cain's hands, the hands associated in the text with an act of taking, became, across generations, the hands that made things for others to use. And Jubal, the brother of Jabal, became the ancestor of all who play stringed instruments and wind instruments. Music. From the line of the first murderer came the first musicians, the people who learned to pull something from the air that had not been there before, something that lasted only as long as the breath or the hand that made it, something that was, in the deepest sense, hevel, vapor, breath, came from the line of the man whose brother's name meant breath and who had ended it. This is not a story with a tidy ending. It is not a story in which the righteous are vindicated in visible ways and the guilty are erased. The text of Genesis 4 resists every attempt to make it that story. Abel was righteous and died young and left no descendants and is remembered in the text, primarily in the moment of his death and in the crying of his blood from the ground. Cain was guilty and was exiled and was protected and built a city and fathered a lineage that produced shepherds and metalworkers and musicians. The math does not add up to what we expect. This is the Bible before it learned to be comfortable. This is the oldest layer of the human story, recorded by writers who apparently believed that fidelity to the complicated truth of what happened was more important than the comfort of the reader who would encounter it. The Apostle John, writing long after, from inside the new covenant, with the cross behind him and everything it had changed, looked back at Cain and identified the root of what happened in a single sentence. He was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. Read that carefully. John does not say Cain killed Abel because he was angry. He does not say Cain killed Abel because the rejection at the altar wounded his pride. He says Cain killed Abel because Cain's deeds were evil and Abel's were righteous, because the contrast was unbearable. Because to stand beside someone whose life reflects back at you exactly what your own life is not is one of the most excruciating experiences available to a human being. Abel was not Cain's enemy. Abel had done nothing against Cain. Abel had brought his own offering, raised his own sheep, lived his own life. The righteous life of Abel was not an attack on Cain, but it functioned like one. Because Cain, standing at the altar where the fire had moved toward his brother and away from him, had encountered a mirror, and the mirror showed him something about the quality of his interior life that he had not been willing to examine. God's question, "Why are you angry?" was an invitation to examine it, to follow the anger to its root, to discover what was underneath the transaction he had been calling devotion, to ask what it would mean to offer not some of the harvest, but the firstborn, to ask what it would mean to stand at the altar without keeping a ledger. Cain did not follow the question. He did not go through the door. He destroyed the mirror instead. And in doing so, he chose what the letter of Jude, writing centuries later, would call the way of Cain. Not the violence specifically, the pattern, the path a person takes when they encounter God's correction and decide that the correction is wrong, when they hear the warning about what is crouching at the door and choose to interpret the crouching thing as an ally rather than a predator, when they walk out of the most direct and clear conversation God ever initiated with them and go directly to the act that the conversation had been trying to prevent. This is the most recognizable part of the story, not the murder. Most of us will not commit murder, but the pattern before the murder, the disappointment that left unexamined, curdles into resentment. The resentment that searches for an explanation that is not the true explanation. The anger that is really grief, really confusion, really the pain of discovering that the world does not operate according to the internal logic we had constructed for it. The closed fist at the altar that looks exactly like an open hand until you examine what it is holding and what it is waiting to receive in return. Every person who has ever worshipped with an agenda knows what Cain's offering felt like from the inside. It felt like devotion. It was real work, real time, real produce from real labor. It was a genuine act of reaching toward God. And underneath it, barely visible even to Cain himself, was an expectation of return that had never been surrendered, an account that had never been closed. This is the wound, not the murder. The wound that made the murder possible. The wound that God diagnosed in the question he asked before any blood had been shed. The wound that was still visible in the evasion that came after. Somewhere in the land of Nod, long after the city had walls and a name and a population that had grown past counting on two hands, long after the children had grown into the trades of their choosing and the city had taken on the ordinary life of any settlement, Cain was an old man. He carried a mark he had not chosen. He lived in a land named for the condition of his exile. He had outlived his brother by more years than Abel had been alive. He had watched generations of his descendants be born into a life that had no right to exist, and those descendants had received that life as though it were a gift, because to them it was. They had no memory of the altar, no knowledge of the field, no sense of what the mark meant or what the land of Nod's name recorded. God had kept him alive. That was the last recorded act of God toward Cain in this narrative, a mark of protection, not of forgiveness, not of restored relationship, not of renewed conversation. Simply, this one is not to be taken by anyone other than the course of time. Whatever remained of the relationship between Cain and the God who had asked him 2 questions and shown him the open door, the text does not tell us. Perhaps Cain walked through the door eventually. Perhaps in the long years of Nod, in the space between the founding of the city and the silence the text falls into around his life, something turned. The text does not say. The text leaves it unresolved, as it leaves many things unresolved, because the text is more interested in truth than in comfort. What the text gives us in the final image of Cain's life is a man building something in a place that was not supposed to be settled. A man laying foundations in a land of wandering. A man whose children were raising the animals of the brother he had killed, whose other children were forging tools, whose other children were making music, and who may or may not have known by then what any of that meant. This is the last picture, not redemption in the clean sense, not condemnation in the final sense. A man in the East, still marked, still alive, still present in the slow accumulation of days that constitute a life, even after the worst thing you have ever done. The field where Abel fell is nowhere you can visit. The altar where the fire refused to come has left no archaeological trace that any dig has yet uncovered. The voices of both brothers have been silent for longer than civilization has had writing to record itself in. But the question God asked before the murder, in that brief, open, invitation-shaped moment when the door was still showing itself clearly, has not gone silent. It has been in the air ever since. In every moment when a person discovers that someone else's offering was accepted and theirs was not. In every encounter with the fact that faithfulness does not automatically produce reward, that labor does not guarantee recognition, that visible commitment to visible things is not the same as surrendered orientation toward the source of everything. Why are you angry? The question is still asking itself, and underneath it, still visible, still specific, still an actual instruction and not just a rhetorical prelude. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? The predator is still crouching, the door is still there, and the choice that Cain walked past is still, in every moment that resembles this one, available to be made differently. The city of Enoch stood for as long as cities stand. The music made by Jubal's descendants entered the air and became the air, as music does, as breath does, as everything does eventually. Hevel, vapor, gone before you close your hand around it. And Abel's blood, which cried from the ground, was heard, not answered with the justice that the reader who loved Abel wanted, but heard, witnessed, acknowledged by the one who hears everything that the ground receives. The last recorded word in this story belongs to the mark, not to the murder, not to the exile, to the thing God put on a guilty man's skin to keep him breathing in the land of wandering, to the protection that no one asked for and everyone should be troubled by, and none of us can explain away. This is the story the book of Genesis keeps. Not the one we would have written, not the one that leaves us comfortable, the one where the righteous man dies young and leaves nothing behind him but the record of his blood, and the guilty man walks east, marked, protected, building, naming children, settling in a land that was named for not settling, and the question hangs in the air over all of it, over the altar and the field and the city and the music and the mark and the long unrecorded years of a man who may or may not have ever walked back through the door he had been shown. Why are you angry? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? The door is still open. That is the most troubling thing the story leaves us with. Not that it closed, but that it did not. That even after the warning was ignored, and the predator sprang, and the worst thing happened, and the blood cried from the ground, the question God asked in the beginning was the same question God was still implicitly asking at the end. Not accusing, asking, still leaving room for the answer. The way of Cain is not the way of a monster. That is what makes it recognizable. It is the way of a man who worshiped and labored and showed up and brought something to the altar and could not, in the end, surrender the ledger, who found it easier to remove the mirror than to examine the reflection, who heard the clearest invitation God ever extended to him in a direct conversation and walked out of it unchanged and went directly to the worst version of what he might have become. The door was never closed. That is the most terrible grace in this story. The door was never closed. And Cain walked out of the field and into the east and built a city in the land of wandering and died under the mark that kept him safe. And what he did with the door between the building and the dying, the text does not tell us. It leaves that part in our hands. Dado, if this story moved something in you, if you recognize something you did not expect to recognize, tell me in the comments. I read every one. There is something the story of Cain and Abel does that almost no other ancient text does. It refuses to simplify the man who did the wrong thing. In the mythologies of the ancient Near East, in the stories that surrounded Genesis, in the cultural world from which it emerged, villains tend to be clearly villainous. They are monstrous in form or monstrous in motivation. They do terrible things for reasons that are legible from a distance. Greed, power, jealousy, in its most theatrical form. They do not sit with you afterward and make you check your own chest for the same wound. Cain is different. Cain is recognizable in the way that the most careful mirrors are recognizable. You do not see a monster. You see a man who worked hard and expected return. A man who gave something and waited for the accounting to balance. A man who, when the accounting came back wrong, went looking for the cause in the wrong place, outward, toward his brother, rather than inward, toward the ledger he had been keeping. This is what the letter of 1 John means when it tells its readers, do not be like Cain, do not commit murder. That is obvious. The deeper instruction is, do not be like Cain in the orientation that preceded the murder. Do not love the world in the way Cain loved his labor, with an expectation of return rather than a posture of surrender. Do not stand at the altar with an open hand and a closed accounting system. Do not look at the brother whose offering was accepted and ask why he is enough and you are not, while declining to ask what it would mean to actually surrender the ledger. The Apostle John wrote those words to communities of people who were not murderers. They were, in many cases, people who had sacrificed considerably for their faith, who had given up social standing, family relationships, economic opportunity, who had given real things and waited for the return that faith seemed to promise, and who sometimes encountered the discovery that other people's faith appeared from the outside to be more accepted than their own, who felt occasionally the fallen face, who heard occasionally the voice underneath the anger saying, why him and not me? To those people, which is to say to most people reading this at one time or another, the instruction is, do not go the way of Cain. Go through the door. Follow the question to its honest end. find out what the offering was missing. Not the agricultural category of the offering, the posture of the person who brought it. The Hebrew Scriptures are full of men and women who brought imperfect offerings and were still met. Moses, who argued with God about his qualifications and went anyway. Gideon, who tested the same divine promise twice with fleece and still marched. Jacob, who wrestled and demanded a blessing and was renamed and walked away limping and was not rejected. The Bible is not primarily a record of people who got it right the first time. It is a record of people who were met in the middle of their getting it wrong and who, in most cases, chose to engage with the meeting rather than walk away from it. Cain's failure was not the offering. Cain's failure was the door. The moment God came to him in his anger and asked the question and showed him the open passage, and Cain walked past it, not in a dramatic refusal, not with a declaration, simply in the way people refuse the hardest invitations, by going very quiet and then going somewhere else. Abel's blood cried out. That phrase, the blood crying from the ground, has resonated through the entire subsequent literature of the Hebrew and Christian traditions in ways that exceed its immediate context. The writer of Hebrews returns to it. By faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead, not through descendants, not through monuments, through the quality of what he offered, which was remembered and honored long after the offering was gone, through the fact that God heard the blood, which means that the silent, the unanswered, the killed before their time are not simply erased. Something of them reaches the ear of the one who made them. Something of them speaks from the ground. This is not the same as justice in the human sense. It does not give Abel back his life. It does not give him the lineage he might have had. It does not reverse what Cain's hands did in that field. But it is something. The text insists that it is something, that the blood was not simply absorbed into the indifferent earth, that it spoke, that it was heard, that whatever accounting exists in the reality that made both brothers and the field they stood in, Abel's end was not unwitnessed. The blood of Abel crying from the ground is, in the typology that runs through the entire arc of the Scriptures, connected to another moment of blood. The writer of Hebrews places them explicitly in comparison. You have come to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Abel's blood cried for justice, for acknowledgement of the wrong done, for the accounting to be set right. The blood the writer of Hebrews has in view speaks something different. Not the cry of the wronged for justice against the one who wronged them, but something that operates in the opposite direction entirely. This is the typology underneath the story. Abel, the righteous one whose blood was shed, pointing across the centuries toward another righteous one whose blood was shed, and whose blood, in the reading of the New Testament, speaks a word that changes what the crying of blood can accomplish. This is not a detail the book of Genesis introduces. Genesis simply records the blood crying and God hearing. But it is a thread that runs through the story and eventually arrives somewhere, and the place it arrives is worth knowing, even when telling the story of Cain and Abel on its own terms. The city of Enoch stood east of Eden in the land of wandering. It stood as long as cities stand in the ancient world, built by human hands from the resistant earth, sustained by the labor of the generations who came after the man who founded it, eventually absorbed back into the landscape as all ancient cities eventually are. The music Jubal's descendants made floated up from that city into the air above Nod. It entered the air the way all music enters air, briefly, completely, gone before it could be held. Hevel, breath, the word that was Abel's name. The music made by the children of the man who killed the man named Breath was itself in its nature breath, gone as soon as it arrived, present only in the moment of its making, unable to be held. There is something in that, not a comfort exactly, not a resolution, but something that the text seems to intend, even if it never says it directly. The thing Cain tried to make permanent, his mark on the ground, his city, his name, was breath. And the thing he killed, Abel, Hevel, vapor, was also breath. Everything in the land of wandering is wandering. Everything that tries to settle still moves. Everything that builds still dissolves, eventually, into the same ground that received Abel's blood. Only the blood continues to speak. Only the question continues to be asked, why are you angry? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? The mark on Cain's skin was, in the end, a kind of mercy that did not ask for Cain's cooperation to be extended. He had not asked for it. He had asked in the manner of a man who has arrived at the beginning of something like genuine fear, whether everyone who found him would kill him. And God had answered that fear, not by returning him to relationship, not by restoring what the altar had failed to establish, but by ensuring that the wandering would continue rather than end in violence at the hands of whoever next encountered the first murderer on the road. This is the kind of mercy that is hardest to receive when you are reading about it happening to someone else. The mercy extended to the person who did the thing that cannot be undone. The protection offered to the one who ignored the warning. The continued presence, however reduced, however marked by silence, of the God who had shown the door and had not closed it even when the door was walked past. Cain walked east. He carried the mark. He built the city. He named it Enoch. He watched his children grow up into a life that had no right to exist and was ordinary to them in the way that inherited lives are always ordinary to those who inherit them. Given, not chosen, simply the world as it is. And the question stays in the air above all of it, above the altar and the fallen face and the field and the blood and the mark and the city and the music and the generations, above the east and the wandering and the long silence that follows the last recorded word God spoke in this narrative. The door that was shown to Cain in his anger while his face was still fallen, while the smoke from his brother's altar was still in the air, that door did not close when Cain walked past it. That is not how the God of Genesis operates, based on the full record of how that God operates. The door described in Genesis 4 is the same door described at the end of Revelation, where a voice says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. The one who opens it will find me there." Cain did not open it on the day we have record of. What he did in the long years after, in the land of wandering under the mark, in the city named Enoch, the text does not say. This is one of the silences the Bible keeps with full intention, because the question the silence contains is not really about Cain. It is about the person reading this, about whether they recognize the altar, about whether they can feel the weight of the thing they have been bringing and identify what is missing from it, about whether the question, "Why are you angry and why has your face fallen?" is landing in a place that recognizes it. The door was shown to Cain in the middle of his worst moment. It has been shown to every person in every moment that resembles it since. The predator crouches. The choice remains. The question is still asking itself in every chest that has ever felt the fire move in the wrong direction and had to decide what to do next with the anger. What do you do with the anger? Follow it to the question underneath it. The question underneath the anger is always the same question. The one God asked Cain, the one that opens toward honest examination rather than toward the field, the one that leads through the door rather than past it. Abel is still speaking, though he is dead. His blood, and then the blood that his blood foreshadowed, still speaks, and speaks a better word than justice alone could speak. The city of Enoch is under the ground now. The music of Jubal's descendants has been absorbed back into the air it was made from. The mark on Cain's skin dissolved with the skin, as all marks do. But the word still speaks. And the question still waits as patiently as it always has for the person who is finally ready to follow it honestly to its honest end. If this story moved something in you, if you found yourself somewhere in it that you did not expect to find yourself, tell me in the comments. I read everyone.